To Tech Tuesday. This is the third session out of 3 in our Excel series. If you have not seen any of the other ones, I'd highly recommend you go back and watch Excel 101 and Excel 201 before we get started. Today we're going to be covering nested functions, how to do fully typed out formulas, some other logical functions which can be used very well for nesting, and pivot tables as well. So we've got a lot to cover today. If you have a question at any point, please type it in that chat box there or up in the questions section, and I will be absolutely happy to get to it. We're going to pause for questions after we finish each sort of a block of what we're covering, and that way hopefully it'll be a little bit clearer, a little bit easier to understand what's being presented. If you have no knowledge of functions whatsoever, that's okay. A lot of what we're going to be covering is very useful just for math in general or for typing things into Excel. So either way, it's going to be useful to you. Just a few bookkeeping things to get out of the way first. Housekeeping, like I said, if you have any questions, please feel free to type it there in the box. It's circled on our screen right now that says questions. At any point, if you type it in there, I will get to it, I promise. Another thing to think about is Autopilot. Autopilot is our compensation-based client referral system. So it's a way to offer the services of a licensed representative to quote, enroll, support, and provide year-round service to your clients. They're your clients that may fall out of the scope of your price or your business. Let's say you're focused mostly on selling ancillary products and you want a group to do major medical, then you might send them over to us. Same for the opposite sort of situation. So that's really what Autopilot's all about. Please give us a call today if you'd have a client that you think might need some extra service. Additionally, feel free to check out the Cornerstone Resource Center. Our Resource Center has been completely redesigned and has a new document search function for this year. It allows you to kind of more easily and more quickly find exactly what you're looking for. You can find all your white papers here as well as ready to print customizable marketing materials. So don't forget to check that out. It's also where we keep our 2019 and 2020 webinar recordings. So if you are interested in rushing up on some of the last year's Tech Tuesdays that we presented, I'd recommend going in there and checking it out. We also have all the previous Excels in there as well. Just go to our website, Resource Center, Webinars, and you should be able to find the Tech Tuesday section. Last but not least, we're going to be covering the incentive program. Like it says on the screen, the #1 winner will receive $5,000 and one lucky winner will qualify for a weekend getaway. We also have prizes for second, third, and fourth place, plus 10 $1,000 winners and 6 $500 winners. In order to qualify, you have to sell at least quote unquote 2,000 points of product. And for more details, you can register online at www.crnstone.com/2021-incentive. That is right there at the bottom of the screen, and you can also find it by going to our website and navigating through. So without further ado, let's get into Excel. Now, I have a few documents for you if you'd like to follow along. If you go to the handout section of the chat, there is one titled Excel Sample Workbook Completed and another titled Excel Sample Workbook. That Excel Sample Workbook is what you're going to want to download. And if you actually followed along last time as well, you should be looking at something pretty similar. The only difference is I went back in after the webinar and threw that column for the first name back on with spaces. That's because with what we're covering today, we're going to be doing a more advanced concatenate that also trims out all those spaces as well, and it's just a little bit easier to show. If you have those files downloaded and you're trying to match exactly what I have on screen, you're going to want to delete the first and last name column as well for what we're going to be doing today. And just for some brief review, last time in our webinar, we covered some of the basic syntax right up here. We covered some technical terms for string, value, formula, and function, and all of those are listed right there in your general notes section. We also covered some basic operations, what a general formula and function were. But like I said at the end of the last video, I didn't cover logical operators, I didn't cover logical functions, and I didn't cover a few of the other things up in here. And I didn't cover all of this box. That's what we're going to be doing today. A nested function, by definition, is a function that uses other functions as one of its variables or arguments, meaning that whatever you put into a function can also be a function. This requires basic knowledge of what functions are and how they work first. So that's why I recommend you go back and check out Excel 201 if you're not familiar with it. A good example of when to use a nested function is with a logical function, which we're going to be covering after our first sort of introduction into nests using concatenate. These logical functions use logical operators, which are right up here. And I'm going to be doing a thorough review of what those are, don't worry. But before I really get into it, I want to cover some basic algebra first. And don't freak out and say, oh, but that's math, Tom, this is Excel. The real reason we're covering it is to think of order of operations. I mentioned this at the beginning of my last video, but if you haven't taken Algebra 1 in a long while, just a brief review of a acronym actually, PEMDAS, P-E-M-D-A-S. And what that actually does is stand for an order of operations, specifically parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division, PEMD, addition, subtraction. That's the order in which order of operations work for algebra or mathematics in general. It's the reason why if you do 1 plus 1 over 2, you would first do 1 divided by 2 and then add 0.5 to 1. That's just how it would work. If you need any help with it, what I like to do is I just type out PEMDAS, and that is the order in which you go. I have an example right in here in the text box actually, and this holds true for nested functions as well. When you're doing a nested function, the function considers the arguments first, and then it moves forward. And that's a little bit hard to explain just by saying that. What I mean is it's going to do your arguments before it solves the actual function. We're going to be getting into AND a little bit later as well, but just a good example to review is right here below. It shows how this function resolves, and you don't even have to know what len or these logical operators really mean. All you need to know is it is going from left to right, resolving each of the arguments in the middle of this function first, from left to right, and then finally solving the outermost function. Now, that's the sort of general idea of what nesting does. And I know it's probably a little bit hard to conceptualize even just from that example. So what I'm going to show you today, just to get a really good overview of what this means for you, is we're going to do the last name, first name column from our Excel 201 video in one function. What that means is, if you remember from last time, we had to insert 2 columns here in order to trim both of these. And if you're using the function window, you would hit the function button, select trim, click on that cell, and hit OK. And I'm going to slow it down a little bit for you here in a second. But then I would extend my trim all the way down. And lastly, in this column here, I would put concatenate, which, using the function window again, is concatenate. It's in my quick bar here, but if you're having trouble locating it, you would just type conc or fully type out concatenate, hit go, and then it might pop up here. Typically, you want to type out the full name of the function when using the search, so it would be concatenate, C-O-N-C-A-T-E-N-A-T-E. I'll hit go. I'll grab concatenate, choose my last name. Using my syntax for commas, for text, I would do quote, comma, space to add the comma and space into the formatting. And then lastly, for text 3, I would select the newly trimmed first name line. Hit OK, and just extend that all the way down. And that's what I would have to do without nesting in order to combine those two individual name columns into one name column. One reason you might do this is if your formatting for your names is slightly different in the database you're using, or if you wanted to make it a little bit easier to read without referencing two separate columns. Let's say you wanted to sort everyone out by exactly one matching name instead of first by last name, then by first name. It would be a good idea to make a combined last first name column in these sort of scenarios. But if I delete that column now that I have my first last name made, it'll give me a reference error. And if I undo that and do a copy, paste value, then I can delete these, yes. But now I still have these two columns with their spaces. Yes, I could delete the base columns anyway after I did a paste value. But instead, I think it's a little bit easier if instead of making two columns, we just have the one and we work with this formula already. When you're doing a nested function, it's important to think of the innermost steps first. So if we want a last name, first name column with no additional spaces, the first thing that I would think to do is to combine these columns together. The way I would do that is what we already did with concatenate. I hit my function button, find concatenate in my recents, select last name, and basically do what I just did. I do last name, comma, space, and then in text 3, I'm going to do my first name. Now, just like in our last webinar, we extend that down the line, it'll still have those extra spaces. But what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to copy the exact formula that I used up here, minus the equal sign in this cell. So I'm just going to highlight it in the formula window and hit copy. Then I'm going to delete the entire column of data and think, okay, what else would I do in order to get this concatenate to work? Well, I need to trim the data down. Instead of applying a trim function to first name, then last name, and then concatenating, I can actually do that all at once. If I go into my function window and select trim and look at exactly what it does here in the bottom box, it says it removes all spaces from a text string except for single spaces between words, which means that if we already have our last name and first name together in a box, then trim will remove all the extra spaces for us. If I hit OK, though, I see that trim only has one argument, one box here. If I then paste our concatenate function into the trim function, I don't even have to hit enter to see the result. It goes from Adams with lots of spaces and John to Adams with one space and then John. If I then extend this formula all the way down, it doesn't matter how many spaces there are in between words. I don't have to worry about column A, then column B, then pull it all together. I've got those two columns coming together, and then I'm trimming them. That's sort of the most basic concatenate trim, the most basic nested function I could think of just for this sort of example. And there are a lot of other easier ways just to get this sort of a string, but it's a good way for you to look at the basics of what nesting really is. Now, like we said before, I prefer to type out my formulas, and that's because it helps me think about this a little bit easier instead of just deleting one function, plugging it back into the function box like we have up here and doing all of that. I think it's a lot easier to just type it out because of what I'm about to show you. If I were doing this with a manual type, and I'm gonna delete all of that data first, instead of using my function box with the arguments, what I would do is first, I would think I need to concatenate. So I type concatenate, if I spell it correctly, and do my open parenthesis. As you can see below, it has text1, text2, ... What that means is that I can have as many arguments for the concatenate function as I want. And if I scroll over and click on text1, it's not actually doing it for me right now because I'm in the middle of my function and in the middle of my presentation. But typically what it'll do is it'll open up a full description and link of what the function does there if I click on concatenate. This is the Excel help menu. And what it does is it explains what the function is, what the arguments are, and briefly what everything needs to be in order to get through this. So instead of just using the function wizard, if I ever need help, I can always click on that, which is another one of the reasons why I prefer to fully type out my formulas. Either way, we have a few different arguments for this function that we were going to use. We're going to use B2, our quotation, comma, space, and C2. Now, before I extend this formula down the line, I would think, okay, what else do I need to do to it? Instead of highlighting this section, cutting it, and going back into the wizard, I think, well, all I need to do is trim this. So instead of going back into the wizard and copying and pasting what I had, I'm just going to type text. Or I'm sorry, trim. I see it has the one argument. I close my parenthesis, and I'm done. I don't have to bother with copying and pasting formulas in. I don't have to bother with thinking, okay, but which argument should I put this box into? I just type it out and I'm done. That's why I'd highly recommend you just get used to typing out formulas if you're thinking you're going to be doing a nest. There are a lot of other uses for nests, however, and that ties back into our logical functions over here. For example, the if function. It's a logical function that basically executes one thing or another. You have a logical test, something that it does if your logical test is true, and something that it does if the logical test is false. Another important one is if error, and we're actually going to be using these two formulas together here in a second. But in order to do that, you need to know what logical operators you can use. There is less than, greater than, less than or equal to, greater than or equal to, and not equal to. And of all of these, the not equal to is probably the least obvious one. What it actually is a combination of less than and greater than. So instead of saying, I want something to not equal this, it's really saying, I want a value that is less than or greater than this value. So it's kind of like a logical loophole, I guess, but that one's the least obvious one to remember. We can also use the equal sign as a logical operator, meaning we want one cell equal to another. And that's really useful for this if section here. So I have a very good example of when this would be useful actually in our working file. One example is when you want to export policy numbers. At the end of last session, we covered VLOOKUPs. And what I did there is I just deleted all the data in column F, because for this example, we are going to be using a nested VLOOKUP function. Let's say that I only want to pull policy numbers from a list for full-time employees. That's going to be our test today. What I would need to do is I would need to first do a VLOOKUP. Then I would need to apply the condition to that VLOOKUP. So thinking through it, I would think first, I need to actually run the VLOOKUP. Then I need to use my if function to cut out any extraneous data from my VLOOKUP. Before I continue and jump into this, are there any questions over nesting in general, or any questions on using the menu versus typing things out? I'll wait a second before I move on here. All right, I don't see any questions. If you're in the middle of typing, please go ahead and finish. But I'm going to move on and first think about my VLOOKUP. What I'm going to be doing is I'm actually going to be doing a VLOOKUP for the policy number based on our concatenated first last name column. In our reference file over here, I already have the Adams John no spaces, like none of the extra spaces, and I have the full policy number. So first I'm going to export our policy number here based on the first last name column. And I'm going to do this first using the full menu, and then I'm going to be doing it just typing out. So either way, you're going to sort of get a feel for what this is. If I click on the function box and use our VLOOKUP, we remember we have 4 separate arguments for this. We have the lookup value, the table array, the column index number, and the range lookup. I'm going to hit OK. And for the lookup value, it's any value that we want to match to our table of reference values. We're basing our VLOOKUP on the first last name column. So I'm going to click on the first cell that lines up with this that has the first and last names. Then we have our table array. If I click on the reference file tab, I know I need all the first and last names, and I need the policy numbers. So I drag my range all the way to the policy number section, and I drag it all the way down my data to the bottom. Now, remembering our syntax, if I don't want this reference table to move when I move the formula, I'm going to have to lock it in with $signs. Typically, when you're doing a VLOOKUP, you're going to be doing it against a worksheet that is not in the same workbook as what you're using. But if you're doing it within the same workbook, you have to make sure to remember to add the $signs. And that's just so your table array won't move when you extend your formula down the line. Then we have a column index number. What this column index number means, just as a review, is it means which column in your data table that you referenced up above are you going to export. In this case, we're exporting the third column over because our first column is what we're matching to, the first last name. Our second column is the relationship value over here, which we don't care about. And our third column is that policy number that we want. And for range lookup, you always just want to put false. What it does is if you put true, is it matches anything remotely close to the value that you're looking up. And that's really not very accurate. So I never use it. Just typing false in there will be all we need to do. Then I hit OK. And now I have my VLOOKUP. If I extend this all the way down, I have all my policy numbers as well. But remember what we're actually trying to do. We only want the policy number to pop up if we have full time over here in type. Remember, we only want the policy numbers for full-time employees. So what am I going to do? I would use the if function. Going back to our syntax, over here I have a logical test, like if a value is equivalent to full-time. Then I have something that it does if that logical test is true, and something that it does if that logical test is false. I'm going to go back into my working file, highlight our VLOOKUP, copy it, and then remove everything from this cell. Going into the functions, I'm going to type if and hit go. I have a lot of different options here now, but I want to use the if function. Now, down below here, it says return one value if true, returns another value if false, which is kind of what I just said. But if you were having trouble understanding that, go ahead and read that section there as well. It's a very good description of what the function does. First, we need to do a logical test. Then we're going to do our VLOOKUP in the value if our logical test is true. And then we're going to have to fill in something for the function to do if it's false. If you don't have anything in this false section, you're going to get an error. So first, what do we want the condition to be for our if function? Well, we only want it to execute whatever isn't true if cell G2 in this case is equivalent to the text string full time. So I'd click on G2. The logical test in this case is going to be equals, and then we have our text string. Whenever you're typing solid words in a reference box like this, you're going to want to surround it in quotation marks just to keep the syntax correct. And I'm going to type full time. Notice that I didn't actually type that in capitals, and it still gave me a true value over here on the right. What that means is that none of the functions are case sensitive. So if you're trying to differentiate a type for any sort of tiered function or nested function like this, you're going to want to make sure that you don't just change one thing based on like a capital or lowercase letter. A capital A and a lowercase a will always appear to be the same to this function. For if true, I'm going to paste our VLOOKUP. And then what do we want it to do if it's false? We could do a lot of things here. We could say we want it to say no, for example, or not full time. But personally, I just like to leave cells blank if it doesn't match the condition that I have. The way I do that is I just do 2 quotation marks. And Excel thinks of this as a text string of 0 spaces. So it leaves the cell blank. And then I hit OK. If I extend this function all the way to the bottom by double-clicking on the bottom right-hand corner, now I only have policy numbers appearing if their type is full-time. You might think that there is an easier way to do this specific formula or get something similar to this, and you'd be correct. We could have just done that VLOOKUP, applied a filter, narrowed it to anything that is not full-time, and then deleted our function. But personally, I prefer to do it this way. And the reason for that is there's less manual manipulation. A lot of the reasons why I do nested functions and why I'd recommend doing nested functions for all of you is because it's very precise. Once you have your formula typed out, as long as your syntax is correct, meaning you have your dollar signs where they need to be and your quotation marks where they need to be, you can do things automatically without having to strain your eyes. You could also add a lot of other conditions to this. This nested function, like the other one that I just showed you with Concatenate, is a 2-step nested function, meaning it does one function, then another. But realistically, instead of just having a blank cell here, I could have a whole nother VLOOKUP. I could pull from 2 different data tables if I wanted and say, okay, if this is full-time, reference this data file. If it's not full-time, reference a whole nother table and just have a whole nother VLOOKUP in there, which I could just manually type out. If I were doing this just manual typing, by the way, first I would do our VLOOKUP. So equals VLOOKUP. Select our condition, which is that first last name. Highlight the reference table and put in my dollar signs. Reference column 3 and type false. Now that I have our VLOOKUP, I would think that I need to type my if function. And I'm sorry I'm going so fast through that, by the way. But it's a little bit easier to save time. And I think that the VLOOKUPs we should mostly be familiar with at this point. If I type if, it still shows me all of the variables beneath. It tells me that first I need a logical test. So I'm going to think I want if G2 is equivalent to the text string full time. And then I'm going to add a comma. Remember, for syntax, commas separate the arguments of our function. Then I would think, okay, I've already got my VLOOKUP for what it does if it's true. And instead of just blanks, just to show you a little bit of a change this time, I'm going to type no if our argument spits out false. And then extend that all the way down the line. Same difference. As you can see now, we have only the policy numbers that are full-time. I didn't have to go into our function wizard. I didn't have to delete this function up here first. But it's a lot easier if you think of it sort of in the reverse of what PEMDAS does. So you set up your arguments first, you throw them all together in a function, and you're done. Earlier on, when we did the concatenate, and first we trimmed these two boxes, B2 and C2, in separate values, technically that was just another way to think of a nested function as well. We separated our arguments into two columns, and then we referenced those two columns when we put it all together. It's the same sort of thing, and it's exactly what you're already doing. The only difference is you're typing out a formula instead of clicking on a solid cell to reference. Now I'm going to go back in and delete my if case, because when we jump into pivot tables, and we are about to, by the way, you're going to want all of your policy numbers to show up. I'm also going to copy and paste values just to make sure they're all there. And if we scroll all the way to the end, you should also have all of these available to you as well. And if you remember our corrected paid total, that was rounded. So that basically covers all of the general nested function options for you. But there are a few others that you might not originally think would be useful, and I just want to highlight them for you before we move on. First is the OR function. What this does is it returns true if either logical condition is true, meaning if you go back to the working file, we could add that into our multiple tiered VLOOKUP by saying if the type is full-time or dependent. The way I would do that is equals or cell equals full-time, or if cell equals, let's say, part-time, PART, TIME. And if we used this as the start of our if function that we had before, then it would execute that VLOOKUP we had if the type was full-time or if it was part-time. And is also very similar. And spits out true if all of the conditions that we set are met. So if, let's say, the box said full-time and part-time, it would only run that if function for true if it met both conditions. So when I say you can nest multiple functions, that's really the power of it. It's also very good for checking if there are duplicates in your lists without actually removing values and checking other sorts of conditions. But in order to do it, you need to know the logical operators, PEMDAS, and all of these logical functions generally. But the good news is we have all of this in our table, which is why I downloaded the handout and got it ready for you. So now we're going to move on to pivot tables. I'm going to remove my filter real quick before I do so. Pivot tables are a very easy way to make visually looking good looking data in Excel. It allows you to very quickly make tables and charts out of long lists of raw data and have those be presented in a way that actually makes sense. And it's also very easy to manipulate and play around with. There are a lot of different things that you can do with pivot tables as well. For example, you can rearrange data on the fly to give an active presentation, is what I call it, or a presentation that adapts data. You don't have to jump back and forth between multiple sheets. In my mind, that's probably the biggest strength of pivot tables, that and the fact that you can present data however you want instantly. In order to do this, I would go to the Insert tab, select Pivot Table, and hit Pivot Table. That's Insert, Pivot Table on the far left of the Insert column, or the Insert ribbon, and then Pivot Table. Now, as you can see, because I had cell A1 selected, it automatically selects a table range for me. If it didn't do that for you, all you would have to do is click and drag through your range right here, all the way to the bottom. Another thing you could do is you could manually type out your reference range. And as you can see, it's already putting in those dollar signs for us so that it doesn't adjust the table range as well. Next, it will ask you where you want to put your pivot table. You can use a new worksheet, or if you already made a worksheet where you want the pivot table to post, you can click Existing Worksheet. A new worksheet will just open up your pivot in an entirely new worksheet in Excel in the same workbook. But because we already have a sample pivot over here, an area for it, we're going to click Sample Pivot. And then you have to click a cell value. That's where it will start your pivot table data. If you don't want to do that and just hit OK, it'll give you an error and say the destination reference is not valid. So you always have to click on a cell in the worksheet if you're using an existing one, and then hit OK. As you can see, it's still telling me my reference isn't valid, and that's because I actually clicked off and clicked back onto Sample Pivot. If I double check here, I don't see anything else in my location value now, so I'm going to hit OK, and it exports that. If you had trouble with that, I'm going to remove the pivot table real quick and just do that one more time for everyone. So it's Insert, Pivot Table, Existing Worksheet, Sample Pivot, Cell A1, and then hit OK. So we have all of these fields down here in the bottom corner, right over here. I'm going to go ahead and circle those for you, right in here. This section is actually the most important part of a pivot table. This is how you lay out what your pivot table is going to do. All of these fields, right over here, are the different pivot field options that you can put in these boxes below. The names actually correspond to the names of our arguments in our base data. So everything over in our working file, which is right over here. I'm going to erase all the drawings real quick. And I actually have a good example of what fully you can do with these, just to sort of show you how you would adapt your data. For example, if I wanted to show the first and last names of all of our clients, and I wanted to show you how much money we got on each of those clients, all I would have to do is take the first last name column and make them my row labels. In order to do that, I clicked on first and last name, and I dragged that into our row labels section. Then I take our corrected total paid, which we've already rounded, and drop that into values. As you can see, it defaulted to sum, and it does that occasionally. It's really dependent on how you populate your data fields. But a lot of times it won't do that. If I click down on sum of corrected values, and hit value field settings, you can see it actually has multiple ways to display data. In this box here that I've just circled, that actually shows you exactly what type of data it's going to show. Currently it's on sum, but let's say instead of sum, I wanted to count how many times this value's paid. If I hit OK, I can easily see at a glance that all of the policies for Craig Adams paid 12 times. If I go back into my valued field settings and click average, I can see the total average for what each policy paid out every time it paid. And I can see the average amount of commissions I should expect for each of these policies. If I go back to my valued field settings, I can even see the maximum payment that I received on them as well. But sum, in my opinion, sum is the most useful one. So I'm going to click on sum. It's always important that you check what your value field is actually displaying when you're using these, because it's very easy to accidentally think, oh, I'm summing everything, and you're actually just counting. So that's the first thing I would check if you're trying to display a pivot table. Now, not only that, but you can also apply filters to pivot tables very easily. Let's say I wanted to then filter my data by carrier. I remember that in our worksheet, we had a section where we listed the exact carrier type of each policy. So if I add carrier to our report filter section in the upper left corner of our little grid of options here, I can choose to filter things down a little further. And let's say only look at American United Life policies. Now it doesn't show anywhere on this table below that it's American United Life policies, but if I look at my filter, I know that I'm only seeing American United Life policies. I just wanted to do Molina. I could look at just Molina as well, or I can look at all of our options as well. But let's say I'm doing a little bit of a more in-depth audit. Let's say not only do I want to see what policies paid, but I want to see what months they paid for as well. We already have a month paid column, but I'm not really sure where I'd want to put this. In my opinion, the best way to list this sort of an option out would be to put month paid in our row label as well. What I would do then is I would click on month paid and drag it into that box and let go. And as you can see now, we have our months paid listed out. The one thing that I notice immediately, and that really isn't the biggest deal, but it's something that bothers me when I'm manipulating data in pivots, is the way that it sorts dates. As you can see, the month paid is 10/1, 11/1, 12/1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then 1/1/18 is down here. The reason for that is that in our base data, the month paid is actually a lot of different types of data. And I did this on purpose to show you how to deal with something like this. If we go back to our working file and we look at month paid, all of our dates look relatively similar in format. And that's because they're formatted as a date. If I look in our format section of the Home tab up here that I just circled, we can see that it knows that this is a date data type. Unfortunately, however, that does not carry over to our pivot table. Our pivot table is going to use the actual value that's in our month paid column. And if I highlight it and change it to general, you can see some of these dates change to just a string of numbers. And that's a little weird. But the reason it's doing that is because this cell right here, this 1/1/2018 in cell M9, is actually a solid typed date. Instead of it being just a general date format, it's actually saying that the string in this cell is 1/1/2018. The actual string in this cell is 43101. And that's because of the way Excel deals with dates. It actually has a base quote-unquote date that's set to the value 1, and then it counts days, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way through to our current calendar day. And that's what it considers to be the month paid date, or the general date setting here. The reason for that is it makes math work. I can do April 1st minus 3 days or something like that, and it would give me the last 3 days of May. So it makes it very easy for Excel to do the math, but it makes it kind of hard for us to present things sometimes. And there is a function that's not on our formula and syntax general notes here that can be useful for this. And I'm going to show you what it is now. I'm going to name our new column N, corrected, month, paid. And then I'm going to type out our function. And this isn't actually even nested. It's just called text. What the text function does is it changes your string of numbers or whatever it is into a solid text option. And it actually can be used to convert a lot of different other things as well. But in this specific case, we're going to convert our string values of numbers and dates or whatever it is into the same format. So we're going to use text, T-E-X-T. Now we have 2 arguments for this function. We have a value, which in this case is our cell value, M2, and we have format text. There are a lot of different ways to format your text here. In my opinion, I use this for all of my date formulas so that they match very exactly if I'm manipulating them. But you could even do it for a string of random text, lots of different numbers and letters, and put them all into just letter format. You could do that by, in quotation marks, using the code of your format. For our date code, we're going to use MM, DD, YY, YY. And what that tells Excel is we want 2 values for our month, a backslash, 2 values for our days, a backslash, and 4 values for our years. If Excel already has a date stored in the column, it'll automatically formulate it that way. And if Excel sees a string of text that nearly matches this format, it will automatically make that match the full format listed. It's a lot easier to just look at it and see what it does than for me to explain it. As you can see now, we have 2 values for our month, 2 values for our days, and 2 values for our years. If I slightly modified this formula and took out the first M and the first D and hit enter, I actually cut off those 0 values. But for our pivot table, those zeros are exactly what we want. And if I scroll all the way to the bottom, even in this function, you can see it's converting the string of numbers that are formulated as dates into solid text dates using our function. I'm going to go ahead and add those zeros back in, because if not, then the dates won't be formatted quite right. I extend that all the way down the line. And then I go back to my sample pivot. As you can see, nothing updated. In our pivot field list right up here, we don't even have other months that we could use. We don't have the column we created. And this is because it doesn't automatically update pivot tables. In order to update your pivot table, you're going to want to go into the soft tab up here for pivot table tools, and you're going to want to refresh your chart. In order to do that, I would go to, where is it? I would go to Options and then Refresh All. Refresh All is actually right over here under Data. And if I hit Refresh All, as you can see, now over here we have our corrected month paid column. I will remove the month paid from this. I did that by clicking on it and dragging it back into the fields. And then I'm going to apply our corrected month paid below by just dragging and dropping. Another thing to remember when you're arranging these is that the order matters. It automatically generates this table going from the top option in a box to the bottom option in a box. So let's say, have our last first and corrected month like this. It orders them by first, the name of the policyholder, then the months paid. But if I flop them, then it'll do month and have all of the names that paid in that month underneath that. But that's not really what we want to display right now. And that's generally it. If you ever click off of your pivot table and click back on, and your pivot table fields don't pop up, you can get those to show and go away in this show section under the options of the pivot table tools. As you can see, that is the field list. The plus and minus buttons correspond to these sections here. You can expand or contract them as you will. Then you can even do the field headers if you want them displayed or not over here as well. Now that's kind of the basics of pivot tables and the basics of how you would manipulate data with them. However, you can do something even cooler in my opinion. You can make a pivot chart. In order to convert between the two, all you have to do is click this option here under Tools that say Pivot Chart. It'll give you this pop-up here and show you what you want to display it, what type of chart you want to export. For instance, we could do a pie chart, a column chart, a line chart, whatever we really want. I'm going to choose a line chart and hit OK. Now we've got a lot of data that's displayed in here, so it's not really going to show us anything as of yet, but let's say I only want to display our first month. I do that by clicking under the correct month paid and selecting only January of 2018. And then I hit OK. Now we have it spaced out a little bit better. Let's say I only want to look at Adams Craig, and I hit OK. I can get it a little bit closer and it'll look a little bit better. I want to compare that, let's say, to Adams Dan and Adams Jack. Well, now I have 3 columns, each just easily visually displaying to me the difference between Adams Craig, Adams Dan, and Adams Jack in January. I could also just narrow it to carrier. So I only want American United Life, let's say. And I'm okay with it displaying all of our options. Now I can easily see all of the January American United Lives right up here, very simply. We already populated our table, and now we can manipulate it visually. That is all we actually had covered today, and I used up a lot of our time. But if you have any other Excel basic questions or comments or anything you didn't understand previously that we covered, please ask me. You can also reach out to me very easily by sending me an email. My email address is tlevine@crnstone.com. That's tlevine@crnstone.com. So if you had any questions on anything that we covered in either of the 3 series, Excel 101, 201, or 301, please feel free to reach out to me. Excel is incredibly versatile, and I know that a lot of the things we covered aren't necessarily exactly what you'll be doing with the functions or with the options that we displayed. My goal with these webinars was to get you a general idea of what you could do. So if you have any specific questions on something you're trying to solve or something you're trying to do with Excel, please feel free to reach out to me too, and I'm always happy to give you advice. I'm going to be on here for the next 5 minutes for any other questions as well. So if you've got anything else you would like to bring to my attention or ask, now's the time. Oh, and upcoming, by the way, tomorrow we have the individual corner with special guest Evan Altman from UH1. He is going to be covering Golden Rule and all savers policies. And then we also have the Build Your Brand that's coming up on the 17th. Our next Tech Tuesday is going to be on PDFs in Adobe Acrobat Pro. If you don't have that software, that's okay. Just think of it as a way to understand more of what PDFs can offer you. And I'll be happy to walk you through any other issues you might be having with Adobe as well. So that's what we've got on tap coming up. All right. So I don't see any other questions, but if you have one that you haven't put in the chat or that you'd rather ask privately, once again, my email is tlevine@crnstone.com. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed Tech Tuesday, covering all of the general uses of Excel. Once again, next webinar is going to be on PDFs, so stay tuned. Have a great day.